4 years, John Denver was seen as the purest voice in American music. His songs weren't just popular, they felt personal, almost sacred. Take Me Home, Country Roads, Rocky Mountain High, Sunshine on My Shoulders, these weren't just hits. They were soul-soothing anthems from a man who seemed completely in tune with the earth, the sky, and the human spirit. But behind that warm smile and gentle guitar was a storm building, one that would eventually take everything from him. When the news broke that John Denver had died in a plane crash, the world was stunned. But almost immediately, the questions began. How could someone so skilled, so experienced in the air, go down so suddenly, and in clear skies? At first, the answer seemed simple. Pilot error, a tragic, but explainable, mistake. But as time went on, the pieces stopped fitting together so neatly. Whispers of mechanical flaws, ignored warnings, and behind-the-scenes chaos started to surface. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the truth became. This wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a preventable disaster. And now, with years of hindsight, new evidence, and insider testimony, the final pieces of the puzzle are finally falling into place. But here's the part no one wants to hear. Solving the John Denver mystery doesn't make things better. In fact, it makes it worse. Because the real story of what happened on that October day, and what led up to it, isn't just heartbreaking, it's infuriating. And once you know the truth, you'll never listen to his music the same way again. To the outside world, John Denver was everything a star should be. Clean-cut, soft-spoken, and endlessly optimistic, he felt like a living symbol of a simpler, more peaceful America. With his round glasses, acoustic guitar, and mountain-high melodies, he gave people comfort in a chaotic time. Songs like Take Me Home, Country Roads and Sunshine on My Shoulders weren't just hits, they were spiritual. The kind of music that felt like a warm breeze, a reminder that somewhere, peace still existed. But while the public clung to that image of serenity, few noticed the cracks forming just beneath the surface. Denver's fame didn't arrive all at once, but when it did, it hit like a tidal wave. By the mid-1970s, he was everywhere, topping charts, hosting his own television specials, even starring in Hollywood films. He became one of the most visible faces in American entertainment, known for his compassion, his connection to nature, and his unwavering message of love and unity. But behind the scenes, Denver was fighting battles that didn't fit into the gentle, smiling persona the world had come to expect. The pressure to be perfect was suffocating. He wasn't just a celebrity, he had become a symbol. And that came with a price. He wrestled with personal doubts, emotional volatility, and the overwhelming weight of having to keep up the illusion. The very image that made him famous was starting to feel like a prison. Those who knew him closely saw the mood swings, the impulsive decisions, the quiet frustrations he never spoke about publicly. And slowly, the divide between John Denver the man and John Denver the myth began to grow. And once that gap opened, there was no closing it. John Denver wasn't just a singer, he was a cause, an advocate, a voice for the planet, for peace, for people who believed music could change the world. He fought for environmental protection, campaigned against censorship, supported UNICEF, and even championed space exploration. To many, he wasn't just talented, he was righteous. But behind that halo of purpose was a man wrestling with contradictions he couldn't escape. He preached serenity, but often lived in emotional chaos. He sang about love, but struggled to hold on to it. His first marriage to Annie Martel, the woman behind Annie's song, began like a fairy tale, filled with hope, adventure, and deep connection. But as his fame skyrocketed, their foundation began to crack. The endless travel, the pressure to stay relevant, the constant spotlight, it wore them down. And when they finally split in 1982, Denver made his heartbreak unmistakably clear, by cutting their marital bed in half with a chainsaw. It wasn't just symbolic, it was raw, bitter, and deeply personal, a glimpse of a man unraveling. His second marriage to actress Cassandra Delaney followed a similar pattern. A brief spark, a new child, then a quick collapse. When it ended, Denver didn't hide his resentment. He said she made a fool of him from one end of the valley to the other. These weren't just failed relationships, they were emotional collisions that left scars. While fans clung to the image of the wholesome troubadour, those closest to him knew he was more complicated, vulnerable, impulsive, sometimes angry, often lonely. And while the world saw his activism and artistry, the man behind it all was quietly losing his grip. What he turned to next would prove to be both his greatest passion and his fatal undoing. For John Denver, flying wasn't just a hobby, it was therapy. When the noise of fame got too loud or his personal life spun out of control, the cockpit became his sanctuary. He once said that being in the air gave him the kind of freedom he could never find on the ground. And with his love for nature, it made perfect sense. Flying allowed him to see the earth the way he sang about it, wide, peaceful, and untouched. But that passion came with danger. Denver was an experienced pilot with hundreds of flight hours under his belt, but he wasn't without issues. The FAA had flagged him for prior incidents, including a DUI arrest, and at one point revoked his medical certification. Though he later regained clearance, concerns lingered about whether he was fit to fly solo, especially in the type of aircraft he'd come to favor, experimental planes. One of those planes was the Rutan Long-EZ, sleek, lightweight, and built for performance. It wasn't something most commercial pilots would be familiar with. Its controls were different, its systems more complex, and while Denver was legally allowed to fly it, he hadn't been thoroughly trained on its quirks, particularly one crucial flaw that would later become fatal. Still, the appeal of that aircraft was too strong. It was fast. It was agile. It was his escape. But as he prepared for a solo flight over the California coast on October 12, 1997, he had no idea he was climbing into a trap. One hidden not just in machinery, but in oversight, negligence, and a deadly series of ignored warnings. And once he was in the air, it was already too late. October 12, 1997. The skies were clear over the Pacific. No storms, no warning signs, just a beautiful California afternoon, the kind of day John Denver would have written a song about. But by sunset, headlines were reporting the unthinkable. The beloved singer had crashed into the ocean off the coast of Monterey Bay. And just like that, one of music's most cherished voices was gone. The initial reaction was disbelief. Then came the scramble for answers. How could someone like Denver, an experienced pilot, flying in perfect weather, suddenly plummet from the sky? Early reports pointed to pilot error. Some speculated he ran out of fuel. Others whispered about substance use, citing his past. But the toxicology report came back clean. No drugs, no alcohol, just silence and wreckage. 4 days, confusion reigned. It wasn't just that he had died, it was how. This wasn't some daredevil stunt or high-risk maneuver. It was a routine flight, a short one, even. But when investigators began piecing together the events of that day, the picture started to shift. Something had gone wrong in the cockpit, something technical, avoidable, and far more sinister than anyone had expected. Denver had taken off in his Rutan Long-EZ, alone, and climbed steadily into the sky. But just minutes into the flight, something happened. Witnesses on the beach reported hearing engine sputters, then watching in horror as the aircraft turned sharply and spiraled down into the water. It looked like mechanical failure. But what investigators found next would shatter the illusion of a simple accident and open the door to a far more disturbing truth. Because this crash wasn't just tragic, it was preventable. When investigators examined the wreckage of John Denver's plane, what they found was both simple and horrifying. The aircraft hadn't run out of fuel entirely. It had run out of fuel in the tank that was in use. The other tank still had fuel in it. The problem: Denver couldn't switch over. The Rutan Long-EZ had a fuel selector valve placed in a nearly impossible location, behind the pilot's left shoulder. That meant to reach it, the pilot would have to twist, take one hand off the controls, and essentially feel around blindly. On the ground, that was awkward. Mid-flight, it was dangerous. In a moment of crisis, it was a death sentence. Denver had reportedly complained about this exact design flaw before. He had asked how to safely reach the valve mid-flight. He wasn't confident in the layout, but nothing changed. There was no urgent repair, no redesign, no protocol to ensure safety. On that October day, when one tank ran dry, he tried to switch over, but by the time he realized what was happening, it was already too late. The engine failed from fuel starvation, not from a shortage of fuel, but from a failure to access it. The plane lost power, dropped altitude fast, and slammed into the water. And it wasn't just the placement of the valve. Investigators also noted that the fuel gauges were unreliable and the experimental aircraft had no clear safety backup in case of valve failure or pilot miscalculation. In the end, Denver didn't crash because of recklessness or carelessness. He crashed because the system failed him, in design, in communication, and in accountability. But the deeper this investigation went, the more it became clear. The plane wasn't the only thing falling apart. As the investigation unfolded, the focus shifted from John Denver's actions to the people and systems around him. And what it uncovered was deeply unsettling. The fatal design flaw wasn't a secret. Pilots had flagged it before. Safety concerns had been raised. Yet somehow, the aircraft was still cleared for flight, and Denver was still allowed to fly it without specific training on its unique setup. The question wasn't just how this happened, it was how many people knew and looked the other way. The Rutan Long-Easy was classified as an experimental aircraft, a label that gave it far more freedom and far less regulation. Under FAA rules, these planes didn't have to meet the same rigorous standards as commercial aircraft. That meant safety equipment could be minimal. Training could be informal, and any number of risky design quirks could be brushed off as acceptable. Denver had the credentials to fly. But what he didn't have was the information and preparation he needed to handle that plane in a crisis. He wasn't the only one. The FAA had flagged concerns about his medical history, including previous issues with alcohol and emotional health, but those warnings didn't translate into tighter restrictions or oversight. When paired with a dangerously flawed aircraft, it was a setup for tragedy. In hindsight, the signs are impossible to ignore. A complex plane, a poorly placed fuel valve, an undertrained pilot, and a regulatory system that allowed it all to happen. None of these elements on their own guaranteed disaster, but together, they created the perfect storm. And while the public mourned a music icon, few realized how close this tragedy came to being completely preventable, if only someone had spoken up louder, sooner. What made John Denver's death even more heartbreaking wasn't just the mechanical failure, it was everything leading up to it. In the years before his crash, those closest to him saw a man who was tired. Not of music or flying, but of pretending. He had spent decades performing not just on stage, but in life, living up to an image he didn't always feel aligned with, and that pressure eventually started to show. While fans saw the environmental crusader, the poet of the mountains, Denver was dealing with a far more chaotic reality. His relationships had unraveled. His career, though still active, no longer had the same momentum it once did. He had faced legal trouble, public scrutiny, and the slow erosion of the superstar status he had once held so easily. And beneath all of it, he was battling something darker, the quiet kind of sadness that doesn't make headlines but leaves deep scars. Though toxicology reports ruled out substance abuse on the day of the crash, some insiders have long whispered that he had struggled emotionally for years. He spoke openly about loneliness. He wrote lyrics tinged with melancholy. And while he never publicly admitted to being depressed, there was a heaviness that followed him, one that no amount of fame or fresh air could lift. Was he distracted that day in the cockpit? Was he pushing through feelings he didn't fully acknowledge? We'll never know for sure. But what's painfully clear is that Denver wasn't just failed by a faulty aircraft. He was failed by a world that mistook his smile for peace, his lyrics for healing, and his silence for strength. And in the end, that silence became permanent. For decades, John Denver was remembered as a beacon of light, a man who used his voice to celebrate life, nature, and love. But the truth behind his death casts a long shadow over that image. It doesn't erase his accomplishments, but it complicates them. Because what happened to him wasn't just a tragic loss, it was a warning. A case study in how even the most beloved figures can be quietly broken by a system that looks the other way. The more details emerged about the crash, the more clear it became. This was never just a freak accident. It was the result of multiple failures. In aircraft design, in training, in communication, and in care. Denver's warnings were ignored. The aircraft's flaws were overlooked. And the people responsible for keeping pilots safe relied on loopholes and labels to dodge accountability. For fans, that reality stings. We want to believe that legends die heroically, not preventably. we want to hold on to the myth. But John Denver's story isn't just about music, or mountains, or memories. It's about a man caught between the sky and the ground, chasing freedom while quietly unraveling. His death triggered renewed calls for regulation in the world of experimental aviation. Some pilots changed how they trained. Others questioned what else might be slipping through the cracks. But for most, the damage had already been done. The loss of Denver was more than the end of a career. It was the loss of something pure. And once the truth was known, it became impossible to hear his songs without feeling the weight of everything he carried, and everything that could have been stopped. In the end, the mystery behind John Denver's death wasn't about some dramatic twist or hidden scandal. It was something far more tragic, and far more real. It was about negligence, oversight, and a gentle soul caught in the middle of systems that failed him. The official reports might list technical malfunctions and poor aircraft design, but that barely scratches the surface. The real cause was a quiet chain reaction of ignored warnings, unchecked risks, and a man carrying more than anyone knew. John Denver wasn't reckless. He wasn't out of control. He was a passionate artist, a father, and a dreamer who turned to the skies for peace. But the very escape he loved became his downfall, not because of some reckless mistake, but because the people and institutions around him didn't take his concerns seriously. Because the aircraft he trusted had flaws no one fixed. Because he was given clearance without the training or tools to navigate the danger hiding in plain sight. And maybe that's the most devastating part of all. This wasn't inevitable. It could have been stopped. He didn't have to die that day. And knowing that makes the loss feel heavier, like we didn't just lose a musician, but a man whose voice was silenced far too soon by a crash that never should have happened. Today, his music still plays. His lyrics still inspire. But now, behind every note, there's an ache. A knowledge that the gentle troubadour who sang about mountains and stars met an end that was far more earthbound, far more preventable, and far more painful than most ever imagined. The mystery is solved, but the truth still hurts.